a novel by Zadie Smith. Has
Oh,
anyone?
it is?
Yeah, but
It's on my list. So I was like, oh God, I filed it under nonfiction. Oh, okay. Go live. Hi. So my name is Christina Chu. I'm the author of Beauty. It's coming out actually Friday. And I thought it would be really a good opportunity to talk about beauty and sexuality. I don't think it's something that people talk about very often. And I was able to find authors who are interested in this topic. So first, I want to ask the authors, what to you is beauty? Is it a concept? What is it? Christina, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. I'm Christina. I think that beauty is a concept.
Wait, Christina, hold on one second.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. You know what? I'm going to introduce all of you guys first before you start speaking. Okay, so Renee Sims' debut story collection, Meet Behind Mars, was a Forward Indies finalist and listed by The Root as one of the 28 brilliant books by Black authors in 2018. She's received fellowships from the NEA and Bread Loaf and teaches at the University of Puget Sound and in the Rainier Writing Workshop. She's currently at work on a novel and a collection of linked essays. Hi, Renee.
Hi.
Christina Rosso is a writer. And wait, can you show everyone your book, Renee?
Yeah.
There you go. Wonderful collection. Okay, Christina Rosso, please show your book, is a writer and bookstore owner living in Philadelphia with her bearded husband and rescue pup. Her debut collection, She Is a Beast, is being released by APEP Publications on May 2nd. That's just around the corner too.
Right.
We also have Mike McClelland. Mike, show your book. Yay! Like Sharon Stone and The Zipper, Mike McClelland is originally from Meadville, Pennsylvania. He's lived on 5 different continents, but now resides in Georgia with his husband, their 2 sons, and a menagerie of rescue dogs. He's the author of the short fiction collection, Gay Zoo Day, and his work has appeared in publications such as the Boston Review, Entropy, Permafrost, and others. Last but not least is Huda El-Marashi. Huda is the author of First Comes Marriage, My Not So Typical American Love Story. Are you showing your book? A memoir. It's a memoir that the Washington Post called a charming, funny, heartbreaking memoir of faith, family, and the journey to love. Her other writing has also appeared in the Washington Post, the LA Times, Al Jazeera, and elsewhere. Okay, back to this question. What is beauty to you? Christina?
So I definitely think that beauty is a concept. A lot of my work in my forthcoming book looks at fairy tales and mythology from a feminist perspective. And in that world, beauty is one of the only categories for women to fit into. So I feel like beauty is something that society has created for us and told us is a thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Renee?
Yeah, I'd agree. It's a concept that we sometimes agree upon. Sometimes we don't agree on what is beautiful, but it's the idea of a person or an object or a thing appealing to our senses in some way. When you first proposed this panel, I was frightened to death. I was like, oh my God. As a writer and thinker, I know that the beauty of language is something that preoccupies me, but I don't think I'm obsessed with beauty as a subject matter. But yeah, definitely on a sentence level, I'm thinking about beauty and aesthetics. I think about the beauty of certain artistic aesthetics.
Okay, Mike?
Yeah, I think it's a fun question to consider, just because it's one of those topics. I think that is huge and specific at the same time. So it's like very fun to consider. I think when thinking about, beauty for me, at least when it comes to a sexuality standpoint, and also if you're thinking about people as beautiful, then I would think it exists almost on like three different planes, where we're thinking of like societal beauty, then we're thinking of personal beauty and actually, like, who we're actually attracted to versus who we're supposed to be attracted to. And I think the third element that I don't know that gets talked enough about in even literature and stuff, like we were just talking about, is how we see ourselves in terms of beauty. And I know that I've been thinking about it a lot. I mean, we all think about it as we age and how beauty happens. Whether or not when we're our most beautiful, if we were our most beautiful before, when we didn't feel beautiful, if our beautiful days are coming. And, so that's what I think. It's fun to think about all three areas and think, how do they match up, or how are they different? And, how am I different and all that?
Okay, cool. Huda?
For me, in my writing, something that I've always had to look at, especially when writing this book, was beauty as a relative concept and a very culturally encoded one. I'm an Iraqi American, and the book that I wrote was about this Iraqi American love story and trying to straddle West and Eastern notions of love, but it was also a question of the Western and Eastern notions of beauty. And Iraqi culture can be very frank and very particular about their notions and standards of beauty. And they're very actually, blasé about saying, hey, somebody looks fat to them, somebody looks unattractive to them, somebody is beautiful for them. And it's something that's always been like that I was very aware of, that there's things that were polite to comment on in American culture and in American society about standards of beauty, and that those standards did not apply. It did not translate across the board. And I think that I've seen growing up with a lot of different immigrant communities in different immigrant cultures where they have very different standards and acceptance levels of how you can talk about someone's physical appearance.
Okay. So one thing that I think about very often is I think beauty and sexuality kind of overlap a little bit, but not in the best ways sometimes. Do any of you have anything to say about that? Mike?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think particularly I've been thinking about a lot lately in the gay writing world too. There's this really interesting thing about how it's very rare to see any kind of sexuality expressed outside of beautiful people doing it. So it's like this really weird alternate universe where you're like, we expect it, unfortunately, in like TV and the movies. You're like, to be a television or movie star, there's this, societal expectations of beauty. And I think that is changing a little bit too. But you would just think that books would be more of an honest place. But I know particularly just in terms of, the authors that, us gay writers and readers grew up on, and then also a lot that's still out there, there's always this huge attention to played when it's coming to expressions of sexuality to the beauty of the two or more, I guess, people involved. I always just think it's fascinating because it can even be like a more literary novel, yet everyone has abs and, all sorts of facial bones that you didn't even know existed. And so it's really interesting to me, that overlap where it's like only beautiful people get to express their sexuality on the page. And why is it that we're doing that?
Yeah, that is a good question. There are a lot of books that talk about body image, right? But what I find interesting is there isn't that much about feeling like outside that box, outside that beauty box, right? There's this little box that is built by this industry, right? Which is like a mega $1 billion industry, right? And we have this idea, and yet I think authors don't always talk about it as much as they could. Like, I remember one of the first books that really hit home for me was Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. And it just got me right in the gut. It was all about beauty. It was all about, who defines beauty, who is in charge, right? Who makes these decisions? And it was that book that really made me realize, like, oh, I do have things to say. I could be a writer. And how about you guys? Anything
Yeah,
with you?
I'm so glad you said that, because as you were speaking and Mike was speaking, I was thinking of that book, and I was thinking of the tradition of African American women writers writing about beauty. And The Blue Sky came to mind, and so did The Color Purple, because
Yeah.
often Black women in this society, in particular, I'm just going to speak about the U.S., where studies have shown that on dating apps, we're the last that are desired, and meet people on those apps, that we're usually considered not beautiful. So I think it's very easy as a Black woman writer to take up that issue and to explore it and to think about what it means to be considered ugly in society, to the point where um, you are devalued not only by the majority culture, but by your own community, and maybe even within your own household, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the one thing that used to frustrate me beyond belief was when people would be like, someone would say like some racist thing, and a well-intentioned friend would be like, don't worry about him. Like, he doesn't know what he's saying, and it's like, he does know what he's saying. You know what I mean? Like, can someone please acknowledge that this is happening? And I actually had an incident during college, and it was a great awakening for me, because I used to party every night, and I would just drink away at every party. And then I realized, like, oh my God, I am missing so much. Like, I started to read 2 books a week. I just was like trying to catch up. So in terms of storytelling, Christina, how does sexuality play out?
In my specific storytelling? Yeah. So sexuality is a huge part of my work. So as I mentioned before, a lot of my work is based in fairy tales and mythology. And my book that's coming out later this week is literally looking at some of the classic fairy tales we know, like Beauty and the Beast, which literally has beauty in the name, like we're talking about, or Cinderella or Rapunzel, and is unpacking these stories to reveal sometimes violent and often sexual content. And this work has been deeply inspired by Angela Carter. And I would say that her collection, The Bloody Chamber, that was published in 1979, does deal with issues of beauty and sexuality, because in fairy tales, at least if we start to look at the earliest versions of them, people are put into boxes by gender. And it's extremely heteronormative, right? And everything exists in binary in this world. And if you're seen as beautiful in this world, you have power, but it's not actually your own. It just means you have prospects to get married, but you also have to be virginal. So if you have any kind of sexual prowess, that has to be hidden. And then if you're someone who shows that, you're seen as evil, possibly even ugly. So it's usually those characters that are seen as ugly that get to have a little more play, if you will. So my work is deeply inspired by Angela Carter. I've been researching fairy tales for about 5 or 6 years now. And so in my collection, I really wanted to look at these characters and give them agency and voices first and foremost. And in a lot of cases, that is giving them sexuality, because that's something we don't see on the page for these characters. So, for instance, I have my Rapunzel character is literally being prostituted by the enchantress who put her in the tower. This is not something she wants. The story is about her finding her way out, but also dealing with how her beauty her sexuality can also be trauma to her. And then I have other characters who are seductresses to try to get out of the situation they're in because they know that they can use their beauty, they can use their sexuality to seduce people to change their circumstances. So it's something I'm always thinking about because I want characters who reflect real people. You know, we all have some aspect of sexuality to us. We all are both beautiful and ugly in our own ways. And so I try to explore that and also write versions of these stories that are so well known from a really fresh perspective.
Great, thank you. Huda, how about you? Is sexuality a part of your work?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the major inspirations for this book, and it's a huge thread and a huge theme. Mine is a memoir. It does touch close to home, obviously. It was my story that I was putting out there, but it was really important to me to normalize a certain kind of story that I think a lot of like young Muslim Americans may not be able to find themselves in. And I think, you know, we're surrounded by a certain kind of sexuality, right, in television and in book. And what I was trying to normalize and allow this population to see themselves was this more a virgin sexuality. I mean, that's kind of something that's actually kind of hard to find yourself in, and it can actually be very fantasizing. It can make you feel like you're ridicule as well, to have no experience, to have no sexual experience, to be going into a relationship where you go from, you know, the first time you've held hands with someone to the first time you kiss them to now you're married and you're having your first sexual experience with that same person. That's actually something that's really hard to find a story that reflects that. And yet I knew so many young people, or not even young people, I mean, I just knew people who had that experience, and I wanted to offer a story where they could see themselves.
That must have been really comfortable for you to write about those scenes.
Yeah, extremely. I loved it. Yeah, it was one of the worst, you know, writing experiences in life. I literally remember sitting in coffee shops like this, you know, trying to work through these scenes and finding it physically very uncomfortable and very difficult. And really feeling like that I was going to, in some way, end my life in many ways with this book, and my life socially and in my community, that I would make myself the subject of gossip, you know, and that I'm this crazy thing, and that bring all kinds of repercussions, and that maybe my family would not disown me because of the work. And to say that has not happened, but it was extremely difficult to write about. But it was something that I believed in so much that in many ways I felt like it was worth sacrificing my privacy for it, that it was so important for this population to be able to see themselves in something, that it was worth doing.
Right. Renee or Mike, how about you guys? Do you have sexual scenes in your work?
Mike, you want to go first?
Sure.
Handing that one off.
Yeah, I didn't. Well, you know, it's funny because I didn't think I wrote that much sex. Like I thought, you know, I write some sex, but you know, I didn't think I wrote that much. And then my book came out, and I went to like a book club, and there was a woman in her like 60s there, and she was like, "It was an okay book, but there was just so much sex." And I was like, "Oh, what's there?" But when I look at it now, you know, I do write a lot about sexuality, and I think, you know, and I think the important thing for me in the storytelling aspect of it is just to kind of, I really like to explore for both humor and for drama those strange sexual experiences that really make up so much of our life, but we never see reflected. You know, so the gay community in particular, but I mean every community is marred by this, but there's this you know, hugely racial element to like hookup culture. And so it's like Renee was talking about earlier on apps. There's so many guys who go out there looking for people, and they'll say like, you know, I'm not racist, I'm just not into Black people, or not racist, just not into Asians. But they really think they're not racist. And so one of the things I've considered in recent stories is just about, you know, how does this actually play out in terms of relationships between people? So what happens if a interracial couple is dating and they go out on a double date with a gay couple that is both white, or, are you able to actually sustain that? Because I think that, it's at least the community I'm writing in is so segregated that but it's kind of blind to it. And so in terms of writing about it, it ends up, a lot of drama, but also you can use it for comedy, I think, in an enlightening way, hopefully, and you're not, parodizing yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's little truth to the fact that, I don't know, it feels like feminism's a little bit like that, right? Like everything's kind of segregated, and it's difficult to actually get the intersections, right? We're going to talk about that. We'll hold on to that for a moment. Renee, how about you?
I was just thinking about how the politics of desire is like really the last frontier, right? Because we all want to believe
Right.
in individualism, right? And autonomy, and love when we talk about the people that we are attracted to and who we choose as our partners. And the fact that race or ethnicity or ability or all kinds of different things can impact who we find as beautiful, I think is really hard for us to accept, right, on an individual level. But I'm in awe of people who can write about it, especially like in fiction, right? I think as an essay, it's a great topic, but if you can really dramatize kind of the politics of desire, then I'm with you. I had to actually open up my book, and I'm like, do I write about sex? Do I? Not much of a prude. And so I could say two of the stories in this collection, Who Do You Love, is about desire and between a Black man and a Black woman, but he's Jamaican American and she's African American, so it's also about like cultural
Differences, yeah.
And then I do write a sex scene in Rebel Airplanes, but really the focus of that story is illness and death. It's about mortality. So the main character is a woman who has cancer, who's dying. And I was really interested in, when your body is physically deteriorating, right, and you know that the end is near, and maybe there are things that aren't working the way that they did in the past, what is sex like under those circumstances? So that's kind of what interested me in that story.
But graphic sex scenes are hard, huh? I think for speaking from an Asian American point of view, because there is that stereotype of the Asian geisha, right? Like there's almost like a hands off, like nobody touch it. But for me, not exploring those stereotypes seems even more damaging, because beneath the stereotypes, you start to see a real person, so that's what I found anyway when I started exploring them. I know that it's a really difficult subject for Asian Americans to read about or talk about even, but I just felt like I needed to do it. So we were talking about how it's the last frontier. Let's continue this discussion. How is it the last frontier? Renee, since you just finished off.
Yeah, I think I just encounter a lot of people, and I'm including myself in this, who don't want to believe that choices that we make in our romantic and personal lives, partners that we choose, has anything to do with race or ability. That we fall in love, right? And we see the inner person and we're not considering the exterior as much. And so making a statement like, oh, a lot of Black men choose their partners then becomes a really loaded, accusation or claim to make, when people feel like, that's not true. I chose someone based on who they are and their heart, etc. So that's what I meant when I said it's the last frontier. It feels like, how do you talk about the politics of desire?
Can you move closer to the mic?
Oh, sorry. How do you talk about the politics of desire and still respect individual choice, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Christina, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting way to think about it. Politics of desire, and I appreciated everything that Renee just said. Something that I try to do in my writing is almost like ugly people up physically. Like I try to, especially because I'm working in the fairy tale genre, I try to create characters that if we know what they physically look like, they're not necessarily this like stereotypical idea of beauty, because I think it's more fun that way. But also, I like what Renee was saying about the idea of choosing people based off of people, like who they are, not by what they look like. And I think, what we definitely see this in books, but a great example of where we see this, that not happening, or it's happening, but in a very specific lens is, TV or movies. Everyone is so attractive, right? And you're like, oh, well, it doesn't matter if this person picks this person or this person because they're both, genetically blessed. And I sit there and I'm like, but these don't reflect real people. I mean, sure, there are like gazelles walking down the street, that happens. But I think especially when we're writing fiction, we can, or, any kind of medium on the page, you can explore what beauty means and what sexuality means and what choosing someone means. And it doesn't have to be as black and white as like they're hot, so I want to be with them kind of thing.
Huda, anything?
I did have to really probe those topics in my book, and it was uncomfortable for me writing about kind of our matchmaking culture and our matchmaking community. It is a market. I wrote about how it's the marriage market where the freshest, sweetest girls never sat on the shelf. And there is some kind of commodification that's going on in in matchmaking cultures where you're looking at people not so much for their inner qualities as their external qualities and what they kind of check off the box. And it goes both ways for women and men, right? What is the man bringing to the table? What is the woman bringing to the table? And I was uncomfortable writing about it because, just like what you were bringing up, Christina, that it has an air of that, the geisha, you're feeding a stereotype that's not necessarily a positive one. But I also think that it's just that we're very frank about something that everyone does. Like Renee was bringing up, that is this last frontier that people are not really willing to admit that they really do make these considerations every day and all the time. And they are, sizing people up. And I thought, what, I'll just write into it. It is what it is, and let the mirror stand. And
Mike, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question, such a great thing that Renee brought up too, is this, that I do think we often ignore it as writers, but as a society too, that who we're choosing as a partner, sometimes the reason that people are attracted to certain people, the reasons aren't entirely healthy or, should be spoken about, and we just kind of ignore them. So you're like, there's always these power dynamics at play, and I think particularly when we're afraid to talk about, straight men wanting to dominate because, especially in publishing, there's so many straight white men up at the top. You're like, oh, I don't really want to offend. But, there are so many, problematic relationships where men are seeking to dominate in their sex lives and in their romantic lives. But I think we can take that even beyond that and think about, what makes someone attractive, what makes them beautiful to someone else. And I always think it's fun to think about, like, certain people end up, you always see these beautiful people that are with somebody who's just like rich and that's their only qualification. But to some people, maybe being rich is erotic, maybe that's what turns them on. So, but we don't talk about that. We always think it's like, oh, they're just like money grubbing and getting their way to the top. But not everybody's sexuality is based on their hips and their chest and their abs. Some of it is based on personality and stuff. But we end up leaving so much of that on the cutting room floor, either, I think because we don't want to offend or because it's such a big topic to take on. And so I do think it's great to talk about and trying to explore ways to get into that conversation.
Yeah, I think the issue of the political issue of writing about sex and the actual power dynamics is so fascinating. And one of the things I've noticed, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, is that I've noticed that men tend to write graphic sexual scenes, but women tend not to. Yeah. Anyone have anything to say about this? Renee?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I'll say that I've noticed that, and it's possible that I just haven't read enough. I haven't read as many books by women that feature kind of graphic sex. And I wonder if it does have to do with power, right? And feeling kind of an entitlement to, I'm thinking of Philip Roth and just how he,
oh my God.
There, and people are throwing bloody tampons and somebody's putting it on a bagel. And it's like, that type of freedom to feel like you can just be transgressive and explore like all kinds of things when it pertains to sex may be related to, your status in society and being a straight white man when all the, publishing heads are straight white men. So I do think that, and I'll speak for myself just personally, that maybe my squeamishness or timidity or fear around sex has to do with some of the things that you guys brought up, which is, so Asian women may be considered, there's a trope for Asian women and for Black women too, right? And so not wanting to subconsciously write into those tropes or stereotypes keeps me away from it, not wanting to offend family, community, friends, and not feeling entitled, not feeling confident enough, I think is part of it for me, to step in there and to write sex however I want to imagine it for the characters however I want to. So this conversation has been really helpful to me to think about what I need to work on.
Christina?
Yeah, so I write about sex a fair amount in my work because a lot of my work deals with sexual violence, and I definitely try to be very aware of what I'm putting on the page because I don't want to further traumatize anyone who has experienced that, and I've experienced it myself. And I found a real shift since the Me Too movement took off in the last few years of people actually being interested or willing to read these stories. In the Rapunzel story in my collection, for instance, you see her being sexually assaulted. You experience it with her. And when I do that, it's for a very specific purpose. And so I find a difference in how I do that versus typically how a straight white man is doing it. I recently read the novel, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. So he's a horror writer, and I really enjoyed this book, but there is a rape scene in it. And I think overall he was very respectful in how he handled it. But some of the language he was using, the specific body parts that he called out, the description of blood and things like that, I was recoiling from it as I was reading it. And I turned to my husband, who was like sitting in a chair next to me, and I was like, I would not write this scene this way. This is really different for me. And the only reason I can think of, because sometimes my work is classified as horror, the only reason I can think of is that he's a man and I'm a woman and I've lived through this. So I don't want to give those details, or I don't need to use like the word vagina to explain something because I have one and I can kind of use maybe softer language to get to the same point, but get to it in a different way.
Huda?
I tend to read a lot of memoir by women just because it's the genre I work in and the genre I write in. I think, I don't see women holding back at all in the memoir space. I think women memoir writers are very bold and very transgressive. And I don't even know if transgressive is the right word, because it isn't transgressive to write about. If you're writing the truth of a lived experience in an honest life, why is it transgressive to include your sexual experiences, right? And so, I'm thinking of Cheryl Strayed and Lydia Yukanovich and Melissa Febos and Lacey Johnson and, as another Arab writer like Mona El Tahawi. Like, there are so many examples of women really, really exploring all angles of their sexuality in their true writing, which is where you would think that they would be shying away from it because it's so hard. But I think it's also something that speaks to the nature of memoir and how memoir calls us to, if we're going to write an authentic lived life, then there is no way to exclude this topic. Uncomfortable, comfortable, it has to be there. And that's part of something that I understood very early on when I was writing my book, that as much as I didn't want to include, for example, a wedding night scene, that if I was telling the story of two virgin newlyweds, that it would be very disingenuous to exclude it as well.
Mike, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just think it's a great question, because I think it is, a lot of it ends up being about, who has the permission to write certain things. And I do think that there's like an expectation for female writers and female, that the idea is that, sex needs to be considered for more than something than just sex. So I do think men are allowed to just you can have a novel written by a man that's about something that doesn't really involve that much sex, but it can have like a hot sex scene thrown in there just because it's interesting. Whereas a woman, there's this expectation, either societally or in the publishing industry, that it's like, you need to consider whether or not that was traumatic. You need to consider, the emotions of that. And so I do think it's really interesting, from that perspective. And then I think also just, I find that I usually think that my writing is like, there is a lot of sex in it, but I don't think of it as being that graphic. But I remember particularly being in a lot of workshops where it's mostly, straight writers. They're always like, this was really graphic. And I'm like, no, I mean, it's just, when there's gay sex, there are a lot of dicks involved. Like there's just like, and you have to describe it like so many different words, use your dick thesaurus as much as you can. And so it ends up being a lot there. And, so I think it does end up seeming more like, you're writing a ton of sex, but you're really just, considering how you grew into yourself, and I think the thing about, the gay community is, yes, it is over-sexualized, but at the same time, the gay experience is over-sexualized. That's how many people learn how gay they are, if they're gay, that kind of thing is through sex. And so, by saying it's like, this is a graphic piece of writing, when you're really just considering how you lived your life, I think is really an interesting space to be in. And I know particularly a lot of my writing gets seen as more of like a romantic type of thing, rather than a literary thing, simply because people are having sex and enjoying it. And so, I do think that's something that's really interesting to consider across the board.
So wait, so you feel that your work is considered less literary because there's sex in it?
I would say for sure. And I know, when I was doing my MFA and now I'm working in a PhD program, my writing has been consistently either referred to as, romance or erotica. And I'm like, and I love reading romance and erotica, so I'm not offended. But it certainly was not the intent that I had going in with these. And so I do think that it's considered less literary when you do have scenes of people, having sex and it not being about, it being more about the relationship than about something else, for instance.
Okay. Well, I really hope that changes because I have a lot of sex in my book and I'd like to consider it literary. But so I have this idea that, how like when there's that double standard with girls, like if a guy has sex, it's like, okay, whatever. But if a girl has sex, it's like she ends up suffering the consequences, right? I wonder sometimes if women, like, without realizing it, stay away from writing about sex for that reason. What do you think? I mean, I just find it baffling that that there really aren't that many scenes, except like the scenes that I remember in my mind are written by men, and they're not necessarily good. They're not exactly like what I think a woman would think. I mean, so how about you guys?
You know, when Mike made his last comment, it got me thinking about the comment I had mentioned about women being bold and transgressive in their writing. But I wanted to add to that the level of censure, though, is not the same. Like, maybe they're doing the work, but the standards that they're held to and that the criticism that's leveraged against them there is a double standard. And, as an exercise, when I was struggling with some negative reviews, I went and read all the negative reviews of female memoirs that I love and I hold in high regard and high esteem. And I kid you not, they could have literally been copy-paste jobs. Mm-hmm. They were so similar. And so there is just a real societal kind of gut reaction to women talking about certain topics, to women even just being honest about their lives, let alone their sexuality. We hold women across the board to very different standards. They were all incredibly similar, using terms like spoiled, brat, selfish, unlikable, and then it's really, I think, it become a euphemism for just a woman being honest.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think in the literary world, we have this idea that things are objective. And to a certain degree, maybe, yeah, right? But then that's not really true. I mean, so much of that is determined by what you believe is good or
absolutely.
right.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that this is one of the reasons why women get marginalized when it comes to this, because it's sort of like you're not supposed to speak. You're just, let's shoo you under the rug, like go under there. And I don't know. I mean, I just really hope that women claim that space, that they can start writing about it in ways that I see men write about it. Just because, I mean, we are all sexual beings, and it's like we're so afraid to write about sex, and we're so afraid to, like, why are we afraid to read about sex? Why wouldn't people want to see it? I don't know. Maybe I don't want to speak for all you guys. You guys say something.
I was just going to add, and I want to read it. I want to read about sex that's pleasurable too, right? So there's sexual violence, but there's also a lot to be written about, in just in terms of the erotic.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the points that Mike brought up is that it's easy to end up being categorized as erotica, right? There's nothing wrong with being labeled erotica, but there's nothing wrong with being labeled literary either, right? So the question is why? Mm-hmm. Really? For me, anyway. How about you guys?
I was just
I think it still really is that last friend. Oh, sorry, Christina.
You go ahead, Huda.
You go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I was sitting here I have to think of a book where a female writer talks about sex for pleasure, and people like the book. I was like, I have to think of an example. And so one of my favorite books that I read in 2019 was The Confessions of Franny Langton by Sarah Collins. It is historical fiction, loosely based off of actually someone who was a male slave, but she makes the character Franny female. And she ends up having a romantic relationship with her mistress once she becomes a free person of color in England. And so you do get sex scenes and you get a full relationship. And it's written beautifully. The book has won all sorts of awards, and I keep trying to pitch it to people at my bookstore because it's a really great book. And I haven't seen anyone deem it as erotica, but that is literally the only book I can think of that I've read anywhere in the last couple of years where a female author went there and didn't seem to get, kind of any negative, like at least that I've seen, negative reviews about it. But I think also when we were talking earlier about reviews that female writers get, I just think in general, like, why wouldn't the literary world reflect the real world? Whereas, if you present as a woman, people often think that they can ask you questions about your marital status or whether or not you have children. I used to teach as an adjunct writing professor at a Catholic university. I'm not Catholic, but I taught there and was constantly just like, well, how soon are you and your husband going to start a family? And I'm like, never. But I couldn't just, in that space, I couldn't say that, because if it got back to someone who is more rigid in their beliefs, I might be out of a job. So if women have these expectations in society and expectations to be censored, if you don't want to have a child or you don't want to get married or you want to talk about your sexuality, don't do that, right? Why wouldn't it be reflected in the literary community? Not that that's okay, but I can see why we see that often.
Huda, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say to the question you posed before, like, why is it so hard? And I think it still is this topic that is very taboo. It still goes back to that very primal of what is private and what shouldn't be spoken about. And, I used to think, even when I was writing this book, that the taboo culture was stronger in my own culture, in the Islamic culture and the Arab culture. And that's why I was particularly struggling, that for us, this shame story was larger than it is for anybody else. And, when I was working this through with my writers group, a lot of them would laugh and be like, but your story's so innocent. Like, yes, you're writing about sex, but you're married, it's with your spouse. But, when it came out in the world and I was having conversations with women about the book, I realized how not culturally specific it was, and how, we imagine people are, just because we see it so much in television and in movies and in books, that a lot of people are having sex and they're having certain kinds of sex. But in writing this book, I've met so many women from all backgrounds who really are not having that much and who really did relate to my character and her struggles. And it didn't matter background or not, but that saw themselves in this and did feel like, oh my God, that was such a big thing to have written about. So that sense of taboo and shame kind of translates across cultures.
And that's a really good point. And I think that it's sometimes easy for us in 2020 to remember, not for us per se, but just collectively, sometimes it's hard.
People,
people to remember that, women's sexuality was heavily, surveilled and policed. One of the books that I taught this semester, and it's not fiction, it's nonfiction by Saidiya Hartman, is titled Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And she looks at young Black women who are migrating from the South at the turn of the 20th century into Philadelphia and New York. And how they were surveilled and policed and considered wayward. But she is rethinking what they were doing and how they were, these modernists. She was like, we can't think of the flapper girl without knowing that it was built on the ghetto girl, right? So thinking about the ways that young Black women in the early 1900s were, pushing back against certain normative ideas about domesticity, et cetera, and really looking for liberation sexually and otherwise. And that word wayward comes from the Wayward Minors Act in New York, and it was only applied to young women. And in application, it ended up only to really applying to Black young women, where you could be found guilty and thrown in jail for like being in a rented room having sex with a man. And it was a way for them, and it wasn't a crime, but it was meant to catch the potential for future crimes, right? So it was a way to kind of police women's sexuality because there was all this fear about prostitution, etc. So yeah, like it's a huge taboo, and it's still with us, even though we think we're so liberated in 2020. And so yeah, I just when Huda said that, that came to mind.
Yeah. So we're going to have to wrap up soon. So I'm just going to pose one more question. In terms of your own writing, do you see yourself writing more since the Me Too movement started, or less about your sexuality since then? Mike?
Yeah, I think it's been, obviously it's a watershed moment for all sorts of culture. And, I think particularly for hopefully people recognizing across the board that the inconsistencies in power dynamics and things, and how the struggle that women, I think, are facing in all industries. And I think it has reframed for a lot of us, what it means to be brave and honest in our own industries. And so I'm taking a lot of inspiration from the women who were so brave to speak up and all of that. And I think it's made me think about what's important to reflect in my writing. And, I've always thought it was, important to reflect not only the kind of queer experience, but also just about how funny and dramatic your life can be, in all of that. But I think in terms of moving forward and coming and writing in this current moment, I think it's just so important to consistently shed light on how there is just an imbalance in fairness in so many experiences that aren't the straight white male experience, but I think particularly for women and people of color. And so everything from when it comes to your workplace experience or your home life is affected by that. And I think those of us with privilege have kind of ignored that because we've been thinking about just the drama of our own lives, and kind of ignored that aspect of it. So I think I've just been, and I know a lot of people have just been trying to bear witness, and B, try and reflect that world in our own writing too.
Huda?
Yeah, I feel like this Me Too movement has kind of shifted the foundation I stand on as a writer in a lot of ways, because circling back to what we were talking about with the stereotypes before, is previously in a lot of my essays and even in the book itself, that I felt like I was constantly having to make this case and this argument that no, Arab societies, Muslim societies are no more misogynistic than any other society. We just have our own issues to contend with, and it appears in different ways. And I feel like the Me Too movement has kind of leveled the playing field in a way where, Western society has been called and forced to acknowledge the way patriarchy is operating and misogyny is always operating.
Do you have anything to add? Oops, what's going on here? Christina, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I feel like the Me Too movement gave me the permission to write about what I was already interested in writing about. I finished my MFA in the spring of 2016, and I was with a cohort that often didn't get what I was trying to do, or was like, don't talk about these female issues. And then Trump gets elected and the Me Too movement happened. And all of a sudden, the stories that were getting rejected 6 months before were getting accepted. And I was seeing other people writing things like that. So I'm so glad that this has happened. And obviously it took way too long for it to happen. And the Me Too movement had been going for a long time, but it took so long for it to gain momentum. So I think it has not only afforded me, but many other writers, many other artists, a platform and an audience to actually share our work with, because I think that that audience may have been there before, but they didn't know that they were allowed to ask for these kinds of stories, whether they're fiction or nonfiction. And so I just try to continue to write about my own experience and other women that I know who've experienced various things as a woman, and try to do, honor these experiences, both the good and the bad.
Do you have anything you want to add, Renee?
Yeah, the Me Too movement shook me to my core, right? Like all these stories, all of these memories that I had really just not thought about for many years came back. And there was a lot of anxiety as I, would go through social media and see people, because people were posting some of their experiences. And so memories were coming back. And I've had a student ask, have you written about it? So I'm working on a novel right now. But over, Christmas break, I was writing down story ideas. And one of the story ideas is directly related to the Me Too movement, and thinking about the ways women of a certain generation, my generation, had to kind of swerve to stay out of the way of, lecherous men in the workplace, and how you could look at someone's career, so some decisions that people make can be explained by trying to get out of the way of, that behavior.
Thank you. So one final thing. Anyone get nervous that people are going to think your book is about you?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes
for
to
mine,
sex.
it's very obviously me.
Well, yours is you. Yeah, you have a memoir.
Yes,
but
I'm out here.
How about the rest of you?
I don't worry about it so much, because even some of the stories in the collection that aren't inspired directly by one specific fairy tale still exist and are very much grounded in that world. That I think it also helps me to be able to talk about, even if I'm reflecting on something that happened to me or something that's difficult to talk about in general, having it set in that world kind of makes it take a step back from reality. So I don't worry about it with this, but some of my other writing, I definitely think people think I'm writing about myself.
How about you, Renee?
Yeah, all the time. I worry about it well, I've actually had family members say, "Oh, I recognize this." I'm like, no, like that's not you. I wasn't even thinking about you. And so, yeah, this novel that I'm writing, it just came to me that one of the things I'm kind of concerned about is there's a character who has a pet goat, and it borders on like sexual maybe relationship. And of course, we've got lots of plays, and I mean, there's a tradition. I wouldn't be the first one, right? Put it that way. But yeah, I worry about what my 89-year-old auntie is gonna say. So,
yeah. Mike, since you write a lot about it,
I think it's the same. It's always like, I'm just terrified, and people do all the time, and I'm like, I'm not going to write about myself doing that. I promise. Like, there's things that people just assume is you, and you're like, I can't imagine the physics of even that. But it's funny to think about, particularly and because we all cherry pick from our own lives. Yeah. I made the mistake of the first story in my book is named after the area where my in-laws live. And so they kind of think it's about them, and I forgot to change the title. And it's not about them, but it was just one of those moments where I was like, oh shit. So, it does happen. But I think particularly when it comes to the sex scenes, you're like, I swear this does not reflect my own interest.
This is not me.
This is not what I do. So you're like, or you just want to staple the story shut if you're like, mom is going to see them. And, it is one of those, you just hope that people think you're creative enough to think of someone other than yourself.
That's right. Yep.
Well, thank you very much. We're about done. It's almost 8:00. Thank you so much for talking and sharing your thoughts about this topic. I'll talk with you all soon. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Goodbye, Christina. Goodbye, Huda, Mike, and Renee. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, everyone. It was so nice to meet you all.
Thank you.